Joining us now on the debate for the full hour in Washington, D.C., Alan Paller, Director of Research at the SANS Institute. That's an online education and research firm. And here with us in studio, Sukanya Pillay, Director of the National Security Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Ron Diebert, Director of the Citizens Lab at the University of Toronto. And Chris Sagoyan, PhD candidate at Indiana University and former technologist at the United States Federal Trade Commission. Quite a title you have there.
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. Okay, so we hear this term, cybersecurity, bandied about all the time in the media, amongst conversations at coffee shops, amongst conversations with the likes of you. What does it mean? Chris, why don't you start us off?
So cybersecurity is a complex term. I think generally we would use this to describe the state of security on the internet and on the telecommunications and technology systems that we rely on today. Many of the tools that we have are vulnerable because there are flaws in the software that we rely on. Engineers are not perfect. They make mistakes and flaws are found, and unfortunately those flaws can be abused by bad people, and so there's sort of a constant arms race of the software companies trying to fix the flaws, and researchers and sometimes people who are not so nice trying to exploit the flaws and then use those to either steal information from systems, take down computers, launch attacks, that kind of thing. And so the term cybersecurity really encompasses this entire space and the discussion around how to improve the state of security of these systems.
Alan, is that how you define cybersecurity?
I thought the arms race dimension was quite on target, but I would add a couple of dimensions to it. One is, it's the confidence. Security is the confidence that you have in the fact that you are actually dealing with the person you think you're dealing with, that the information you're passing, it gets to that other person the way you expect it to, and the information coming back to you is accurate information. So security is also the effect of all of those flaws and all of that technology. And then the third definition is in its breach. So when security fails and all the medical records of a hospital are disclosed and the privacy of all those patients is lost, that's a security breach of major dimensions. So I think any of those definitions will work fine.
Ron, round us out here. Do we have it down pat?
I think incomplete, actually. I think it's more than a concept that has to be addressed in technical terms or in engineering terms. It's an essentially contested concept and inherently political. It means different things to different constituencies. So if you ask someone in the Pentagon or inside the Beltway, they'll give you very much an answer like that. Generally speaking, it means protecting critical infrastructures from attack, securing the flow of information. But if you ask someone, say, in China or Iran, it means something completely different. It means protecting the regime from political dissidents or from criticism from outside. And it can mean, practically speaking, a much different thing altogether. Also, it could mean something different for privacy advocates or human rights groups who see cybersecurity as securing an open commons of information where access to information and freedom of speech are constitutive principles. So it's an essentially contested concept.
Sukanya, you're the lawyer in the group. When you think of cybersecurity and it pertaining to the law, how do we treat it legally?
Well, I think that we have to look at who's being affected on the internet when we talk about cybersecurity, and our interests at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association are to protect the individuals, the people who use the internet. Are their privacy rights being protected? Are they being kept free from unreasonable or unwanted invasion or intrusion of their privacy? And very importantly, what's happening with that information? If you're gathering information on a person without their knowledge, or even with their knowledge, are you forming a profile about that person? And once you create a profile, what are you doing with that profile? Is somebody going to become suddenly a suspect because they're surfing the net? So these are the concerns that we have.
What are the goals when it comes to cybersecurity, Chris? What are we trying to achieve through this?
It's a very vague question, unfortunately. So I'm a privacy advocate, and so my goal in this space is to try and improve the average amount of privacy for consumers. That means a little bit to what she was saying in protecting people from the government and making sure that the information that people entrust to companies or that they have and communicate with their friends stays within the intended audience. It also means protecting people from hackers so that when you go to Starbucks and you're browsing the web, the person sitting next to you isn't able to hijack your Facebook account because you're using the wireless network. It also means making sure that you're not getting a virus when you're browsing the web. I mean, I'm very much focused in the consumer space and making sure the average person is protected. I think Ron is focused on protecting, say, higher profile targets, people who are really at risk of, say, state-sponsored surveillance and other kinds of things. But for me, it's really about protecting the average person.
Alan, what about you? What's the goal for you when it comes to cybersecurity?
For me, it's an easy one, which is to give people the confidence to get on with their lives, so that they don't have to be second-guessing every action they take. So and all of those other definitions fit for me because they help people have the confidence to act on the internet the way they would act in person.
When I talk to people like yourselves, I sometimes feel like I should never go near a computer again, and I should just go back to pre-computer life and never touch the internet, because it kind of scares lay people like myself. So when I go online, Ron, how safe is the internet?
Well, unfortunately, there's been a massive explosion in cybercrime in recent years, and that's primarily because we've gravitated to new modes of communicating, especially social networking and extensive sharing of data online, clicking on links constantly, sharing applications, using mobile phones, and so on, in such a fast rate that we haven't been able to adopt security practices to go along with it. And there are many stakeholders and constituencies out there that are exploiting these new vulnerabilities that have emerged. On top of that, you have what I would characterize as a major arms race in this environment, a militarization of cyberspace going on as countries around the world stand up the capacity within their armed forces to exploit the techniques of cybercrime for strategic advantage and competition with each other. So it is a militarized space, and it's something that we have to be concerned about. However, at the same time, we have to be very careful about the rhetoric that is thrown out in this area. There's a lot of hyperbole around cybersecurity that's used to justify massive infringements on civil liberties.
What?
Well, in our own country, for example, there has been legislation proposed in Parliament that would allow law enforcement access to data without even a court order, without any judicial oversight. That's the type of serious proposal now that many people would like to see put in place, requiring internet service providers and telecom carriers to not only turn over information to law enforcement and intelligence, but retain that information for longer periods of time. This is essentially the work that Chris has been doing.
What about in the U.S.? Because that's where you're studying and looking at. Is it the same sort of scenario there, Chris?
Yeah, it's pretty bad in the States. And we have a really interesting and sort of strange and confusing situation in that we have consumer privacy regulators like the Federal Trade Commission, my former employer, going before Congress and saying companies need to keep less data. Companies need to protect their data. Companies need to offer privacy by design and security by design so that products are safe out of the box. Then you have the Justice Department, the prosecutors on the other side saying companies need to keep more data. Companies shouldn't be building encryption into their products by default. Companies shouldn't be turning on encryption by default. We want to make sure that when we seize a phone, we can look at the stuff that's on there. And then you have, in addition to those two sort of warring factions, you have the intelligence agencies and the military who are actively discovering and exploiting flaws. So it's a little bit strange, on one hand, to have the government saying, we need to protect critical infrastructure, we need to protect our computer systems, and then have those same agencies paying for and developing exploits to then use the security flaws to break into other people's systems. It's a little bit strange to have them trying to do both things at once.
Okay, we're going to delve into a lot of the issues you just raised, but I want to ask Sukanya, from a legal perspective, what you're hearing from Ron and Chris, what concerns you there?
Well, we're very concerned about the new legislation that's before Parliament. We're going to see what happens now, but the Public Safety Minister just announced recently following the election that this legislation is back on the table. What does the legislation do? Well, as Ron said, it allows for warrantless access to information in some regards. In other instances where a warrant is required, the threshold criteria to obtain the warrant has been reduced. We don't know why this new legislation is introduced because there's been no case made that it's necessary. We already have very effective laws in place that would allow law enforcement to access this information with the proper safeguards. So why are we dispensing with those safeguards? That's a concern. Another concern as well is we're almost creating new crimes. If you are hyperlinking to a site or sending people to a site, you can be charged with hate crimes now under some of the provisions of these bills. So that's a concern for us as well. And also it seems that we are diluting the existing privacy protections that existed. We look at the internet and security from a number of dimensions. One is, what is the law enforcement surveillance of the individual on the net? Another one as well, which my colleagues here are also speaking about, is how does the private sector protect consumer information? Well, there are all kinds of guidelines that we have in place, for example, under the PIPEDA, but some of these new laws seem to be attacking that. The PIPEDA is the Personal Information and Electronic Documents Act,
If you're asking
privacy.
me, it's fine.
So, sorry? So anyway, so that's, when we look at the federal legislation that we have that exists for privacy, are we diluting the standards that we already have and the guidelines that have emerged under that legislation?
I want to pick up something that you said just before this, Chris, which was talking about companies. And what are these big companies like Microsoft and Google doing to protect and secure my private data?
Well, the companies obviously want to make sure that they're not the victims of attacks, right? So Google doesn't want people to be breaking in, even though the Chinese have apparently been able to break into their systems. But it's not good business to be having people breaking into your computers. But these companies do have an incentive to collect as much data as possible about you, because in many cases they're monetizing your data, right? We're not paying Google for our email. You're not paying Facebook for your social networking services. You're not paying for many of the services you use on the internet. And the reason is because you are the thing that they're selling to their customers, their true customers, which are advertisers. And so they have an incentive to collect as much information as possible about you. And unfortunately, law enforcement looks at that like it's a prize, right? This is information that law enforcement never would have had in years before, and now we're voluntarily giving it to these internet companies.
Okay, I want to get both Ron and Alan to jump in. Ron, I'm going to start with you. Pick up from where Chris left off.
Well, a couple of remarks. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said here. I just add a few dimensions to this. One is that there is a major cybersecurity industrial complex today that is having enormous influence on this debate and on policy. And by that I mean huge corporations and a large growing market for cybersecurity products and services that provide technologies and capacities that simply never existed before for deep packet inspection, cell phone tracking, fusing data that's left by us as we do all of our social networking.
You said deep packet inspection. What is that? I don't know what that is.
Digging down into the traffic through the telecommunications pipes to really discriminate what is being communicated. And that's being sold and marketed to law enforcement intelligence, and it's increasingly having an effect on policy, I would argue, not just in this country or in the United States, but all over the world. And unfortunately, in other places where there aren't protections, even as modest as they may be in this country, those are being used to track dissidents and engage in widespread surveillance. So it's a very big concern.
Alan, what do you think of that?
At the risk of creating a firestorm, let me try to take a counter position. I'm an advocate of personal privacy, and yet when I mentioned medical records are stolen, and it's people's health records. It's whether you have AIDS. It's all sorts of things. When that kind of data is stolen, those patients are really concerned about what the hospital did to protect their data, and they're also concerned about making sure that the culprits get caught, preferably before the data is made public. And all of the things that we see as infringements on privacy come with two dimensions. One is the right of law enforcement to go get the data. and the other is the misuse of that data by law enforcement. And what I hear in the comments from my co-panelists is this presumption that if law enforcement has the right to look at the data, that somehow they're very bad people and they're going to do something terrible and they're going to come into my house and they're going to take me off to jail. And I just don't see it that way. I think we have to, especially in Canada, where the RCMP has done just an incredible job of balancing these requirements, I don't see where this abject terror about giving law enforcement the ability to go find these culprits in time to protect people's privacy is such a bad idea.
Okay, Alan, I got a lot of heads shaking in the studio here. You can't see them, but a lot of people are disagreeing with you. So Kenya, start us off, and then we'll go to Ron.
Okay, you said so many things, Alan. I'm not sure where to start, but I mean, let's start. We agree that people have to be protected, and certainly in the example that you gave, if somebody's personal data has been stolen, absolutely, everything should be done to try to protect that person's data, and preferably before a crime is committed with that data, absolutely. Where we are concerned is when you're allowing mass surveillance or mass grabs of data. That becomes a problem because it's not targeted to the use, and we're concerned about access. If you have a specific crime and for that crime you are seeking access to that data, you're going to be checking off all the boxes of safeguards that exist. It's when you fail to do that, when it's sort of a mass surveillance activity that's going on, that you start running into problems. When you get into information sharing that is not subject to some kind of oversight, you get into problems. What are the examples of that? It's not just companies providing access, providing data to law enforcement. It's also law enforcement agencies sharing data with themselves, amongst themselves within our country and with foreign countries.
So the Meher Arar case would be
absolutely, it's an absolute example of that. And what's happening even right now in terms of airline security is you have airlines who form, or travel agents who form, passenger name records. Now these aren't just your name and passport information. These are other things, such as, did you book at the last minute? What kind of hotel room did you search? Did you order a kosher meal? Are you getting a double bed or a single bed in your hotel room? Who cares? Well, somebody cares because they're asking for this information, and then they're coming to some kind of conclusion based on random personal information. That becomes problematic. So that's one thing. But then, as we know in the world, as I think Ron mentioned, we have a number of, when you have information going on cross-border and you have different privacy standards in different jurisdictions, you also run into problems, because what might not be a problem or certain personal information that may seem benign, for example, in our jurisdiction, may be quite serious in another one. You can come up with all kinds of speculative examples, but we have the real one, which is Meher Arar. So there are problems.
Well, I actually have a great deal of sympathy for law enforcement when it comes to cybercrime, because I've seen firsthand how huge this ecosystem is, how massively it's exploding. I also was involved in several major cyber espionage investigations, and I saw victims firsthand and felt their pain, so to speak. In one, we worked with the Office of the Dalai Lama. He lost a year's worth of his personal correspondence because his systems were infected. So I understand exactly what's being said here. However, there is a difference in cases being made for more power and more resources. I think we have to differentiate between the two. We need to be careful that we're not giving law enforcement new powers when what they really need, perhaps, is more training, more resources to do their jobs. In a democratic society, we always have to have proper accountability and oversight. And what scares me is that some of the legislation is proposing to give new powers to law enforcement without proper public accountability and oversight. That not only is a problem for us here in Canada, it sets a signal internationally. So we cannot then turn around to the Chinas, Irans, Belaruses of the world and say, hey, what you're doing when you're imprisoning people without proper judicial procedures or eavesdropping on them without a court order is wrong, when we're doing it here in Canada.
Alan, you standing fast to your your original position after hearing what Ron and Kenya had to say?
So the broad gathering of data and the joining the data together and learning things about people is, if you believe that the people who are doing that have evil motives, is all bad. no disagreement there. If you're going to try to solve major crimes, the gathering of that data and the analysis of that data by people you trust with good watchers, it was the last comment that I wanted to jump on, with the right oversight is absolutely essential, and it does take new powers to do that.
So can I come in here? Which is that in the U.S. where I live and where I believe Alan lives, there is no effective oversight. And so, just a few miles from where he's sitting right now, the National Security Agency was illegally collecting communications of millions of Americans and many, many, many foreigners, and still continues to engage in these activities to this day.
With the collusion of AT&T.
With the paid collusion of AT&T. It's important to note that these companies are not, they're not charities, they're profiting from their surveillance of their customers. One of the really important trends to note here is that surveillance is getting cheaper. Right? So it used to be that you would need to have a team of agents who would follow someone through the streets, right? You think about the movies and you think about these agents hunched over with their headphones listening to this wiretap. Someone's crawled onto the roof of a building to insert these wires. That's not how it happens anymore. Wiretaps now occur through a keyboard, right? Someone types, at a computer. 20 wiretaps can be done as easily as one wiretap. And so the marginal cost, the effort required to do one more tap, to get one more email account, to find out one other person's location is basically zero. And so what we see is that law enforcement can effectively and easily monitor people from the comfort of their desks. So as an example, Sprint, which is the third largest wireless carrier in the US, in 2009, they set up a website where law enforcement could log in and get the real-time location information of any of Sprint's customers with a court order of some kind. That website was used 8 million times in 1 year. Right now, previous to that, a Sprint employee would have to type on a keyboard and find the information. Sprint would charge $250 for each lookup. Now, Sprint isn't charging $250 for each of those 8 million pings, so the cost has gone down and the number of accesses has gone up because it's so easy.
Okay, I want to stick with the law enforcement theme, if you will. I want to bring up some of Facebook's guidelines. If we can bring those up. Here's some of Facebook's law enforcement guidelines. Here's what it says. Depending on the type of formal legal process provided, we will be able to respond to law enforcement officials with one or the more following types of data. And here's some of the things that are on the list. It's not an exhaustive list. Someone's email, their mobile number, their profile contact information, and photos uploaded by other users that have the requested user tagged in them. Ron, to me, a novice at all of this, it sounds fairly benign, is it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, the problem is that these data points that we secrete today, let's say, can be easily collated in ways that compromise our privacy. And it's important as we move to this world of extensive social sharing of data that we look to the private sector who own and operate the platforms upon which we do a lot of this and ask, what are their standards? What are their policies? Most people, when they sign up for these platforms, skim past the stuff that you just read out and say, I agree. I mean, a lot of them, frankly, you have to be a lawyer to actually understand them. The devil is always in the details, as is the default, by the way. A lot of these companies set up their systems in such a way that privacy is eroded by design. You're encouraged to walk down a path, if you will, and give up elements of your privacy just to employ the technologies. You're encouraged and rewarded to do things that undermine your privacy by default.
But that thing that you just read out, that wasn't from Facebook's terms and service. That was from Facebook's law enforcement handbook,
right,
which they don't provide to their customers. And in fact, the only reason we know about it is because it's been leaked.
Yes.
And so my research has been focused for the last year or two on getting these law enforcement handbooks, and I've been getting them from companies across the industry. In fact, when I filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get Yahoo's handbook a couple of years ago, they responded to my request and said that the information would be used to shame and to ridicule them, and so they didn't think that it should be revealed. Right? They thought that their customers would leave them if they knew that this information would be disclosed. And in this case, I was asking for copies of their pricing. I want to know how much they charge the government when they hand over your data.
You're a troublemaker.
And it turns out they charge $25 plus the cost of a stamp. So the important thing to note here is that these companies are being free with the information to law enforcement. They will tell law enforcement what they can give and when, but the consumers who are providing the data and who might be in a position to give the companies less data in the first place, they don't know what can be disclosed and when.
Sukanya, two questions. First one, do you actually read all the terms? You're a lawyer, you probably understand all those things before you hit agree or I do not agree.
Well, it depends. Personally, if it's for me as a person, I usually go to I agree. If it's for work, I'll read all the details.
Right. And so when you hear
But,
when you hear these issues and how dangerous this can be, I mean, how worrisome is it for you?
Well, I am worried, and I'll explain why. It's not that I'm an alarmist, but even with the bullet points that you showed just now, there was one bullet point that said we will give this information to whatever law enforcement regime requests it. Right there, you're opening up a Pandora's box, because there are many different legal regimes in this world that may request that information. And once you hand over that information, what might be legal in country X, i.e. you have to hand all of this over because our laws say so, versus what's legal in Canada or what's legal in the US. These are the problems that you start running into. When you say, well, we have to because Facebook operates in country X, we have to hand over the information to country X. Once you do that, what is country X doing with your information? Very problematic. Where is this person's name or information or photographs? Where is it going? Where is it being circulated? What are they doing with it? We already know that there are databases being created. We already know, we hear all the time about somebody who accidentally ends up on some list that they shouldn't be on. How is that happening? Two other quick points I really want to make. First is, I want to be very clear that we're not saying law enforcement is a bad thing by any means. Law enforcement is absolutely necessary, and they're doing their job when they fight crimes. What we're saying is let's help law enforcement do this in a manner that is effective. If they're just going for mass grabs, it's not effective, it's ineffective, because it can result in false targeting of people, it can result in profiling, it can result in a myriad of problems that we seek to avoid, which leads me to the second important point I want to make, which is why do we value privacy? We can't lose that in the mix of all this conversation. Privacy is, in international laws, in Canadian laws, in the Charter, and in our Constitution, we value privacy. We say that everyone has the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, which encompasses this right to privacy. What is that? It's the right to be free from unwarranted, unreasonable intrusion by the state. Why? Because we believe that in order for our society to really flourish, for an individual to flourish, they have to have this zone of privacy around them, so that within this sphere, they can fulfill their capabilities. So that may sound very aspirational, but if you think about it, if you think about some murder mystery writer who's writing their notes online or something, if you just find that online, it might look very suspicious. But if you let that person spend a year working on something, they might produce the next best-selling novel. So that's a benign example, but you can see how it might get much more serious.
Alan, broaden this discussion for me. Take it into the context of terrorism and how that plays into all that we've been discussing thus far. How worried should we be about this?
So the essential ingredient in terrorism, to understand in its juxtaposition with cyber crime, is that terrorists raise money exactly the way organized crime raises money. So there are schools the Al-Qaeda has in Indonesia and other places that teach hackers how to raise money. Imam Samudra's autobiography shows people how to steal money on the internet. He was a hacker. He's the one who did the Bali bombing and killed all the kids from Australia and New Zealand who were on vacation in Bali. So the main juxtaposition here is between terrorists raising money using cybercrime. The idea of terrorists destroying something through the internet is just too far out right now. So that terrorists also use the internet. They need the internet to communicate. So right now there isn't a great fear that terrorists are going to use cybersecurity to take down the banking system in Canada and cause all our money to disappear in North America.
So we're not at a Hollywood movie scenario yet, Ron, but what are your concerns?
Well, yeah, I agree with what Alan said, and I would just add to it, though, that in spite of the fact that some of the rhetoric around cyber war is exaggerated, we do have to be concerned because there are, as I said at the outset, some very real processes of militarization going on in the United States. Just recently, there was established U.S. Cyber Command. that has ripple effects internationally. So other governments either look to compete on that level by standing up equivalent units within their armed forces, or find strategic advantage elsewhere, as say Russia and China have done, by exploiting the ecosystem of cybercrime for purposes of espionage and even in some cases warfare. I think Stuxnet was an interesting example. A threshold was crossed there in many respects, although the techniques...
I want to hop in here and get you to explain what Stuxnet is for people that don't know.
Stuxnet was a Trojan horse that was used to target Iranian nuclear enrichment facilities. In many ways, it was like a Frankenstein of cybercrime techniques.
Virus.
Exactly. Very sophisticated in some ways, not in others. Most observers think there's some connection to either Israeli or American intelligence. I simply don't know. But when a threshold like that is crossed, I think we really have to be concerned about an arms race in this space. And it's something that we really haven't talked about here. As important as the privacy concerns are, and they are very important, there is an equally important problem around the blurring of cybercrime, espionage, and warfare right now that we need to think about at not only a domestic level, but internationally as well. Maybe through something like cyber arms control, through greater international cooperation among law enforcement. I'm not sure what the answer is, but indeed something needs to be done there.
Alan, go ahead.
Yeah, there's two dimensions of Stuxnet that I think are helpful for this discussion. One is that whenever the sophisticated parts of that get to be known, tens of thousands of people can replicate it, meaning it is the creation of the technique that's difficult. The replication of the technique is not very difficult. And more importantly, it creates a situation, or it adds to the situation where the cost of attacks is tiny. It's near zero. So that any nation that wants to do very broad-scale cyber espionage, or even cyber warfare, but cyber espionage right now, is able to do it for very low costs, small amounts of money. And the defense is at an enormous disadvantage because the offense only has to find one hole in, whereas the defense has to basically block every possible hole. Remember, we started with the discussion of errors in programs. Well, there are lots of errors in programs, so the defense has to cover everything. The offense just has to find one thing. That's the disadvantage that defenders are at, and it's where all of this other discussion about needing more data, needing to aggregate data, needing to pull information together is so powerful. We run something called the Internet Storm Center, which is an early warning system for the Internet, and I went to see the guys at Epic, and I went to see the guys at the Center for Democracy and Technology, who are the main privacy people in cybersecurity, and I said, you don't want us to do this, right? We would be collecting data on all sorts of transactions around the Internet so that we could tell people how to defend themselves. And the directors of both of them said, no, it's fine for you to do it. I said, well, you went berserk when the government said they wanted to do something like this. They said, well, that's the government. They're bad. And I think that's where we've got a problem. I don't think that commercial companies are anywhere near as good as they appear to be, or government is nearly as bad as it appears to be in this whole cybersecurity arena.
Chris, you worked for the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. What did they do there to improve online security? If we're talking about people and governments and institutions need to take this more seriously, I mean, give me a real-life example.
So let me clarify, of course, that the FTC are the good guys here. The FTC is there to protect consumers, and what we've been talking about here are agencies like the NSA and DoD and whatever your Canadian equivalents are that are actively trying to find and exploit flaws to hack into systems. They are the bad guys. And if you want a secure internet, your tax dollars going to find flaws, new flaws, and abuse them, not to fix them, but to abuse them, that is a bad thing. And before I get into the FTC, I do want to push back on one thing that Alan said, which is that these things are easy to do. So Stuxnet used several new vulnerabilities. You can't just go and find those by spending 20 minutes in a library. If you're an Al-Qaeda operative, you don't stumble across one of these vulnerabilities. You have to be a skilled security expert, spending weeks or months to find these things. And the security flaws are being sold on the open market right now to government agencies for $50 or $100K a pop. Now, that's certainly cheaper than a Stinger missile, but these are expensive, and you have to have the ability and the resources to go out and get them. And so these, countries like the US and China that have the most purchasing power are going to have the upper hand in cyber warfare, and countries with smaller military budgets are going to not have the same advantage. Now, to the FTC is primarily a consumer protection agency. They seek to improve the state of online privacy and security, and so they go after companies that tell consumers that they're protecting their data when in fact they don't protect their data. They go after companies that are leaving personally identifiable data in dumpsters or not encrypting the data, doing really, really bad things that then get 60 million credit cards lost or stolen. And the FTC is really sort of trying to move things forward, but the FTC has this much power and weight in Washington, and now that cyber warfare and cyber hacking and cyber terrorism are buzzwords, NSA has this much power, and so you can sort of see where things are going and who has the influence.
The FTC apparently is the good guy in the U.S., Ron. Who's doing good here in Canada? Who's helping us out?
Well, there are lots of people who are doing good. Our privacy commissioner is world-renowned for the work that her office has done in terms of really holding private companies accountable for the decisions they take in terms of storage of data. There are many researchers in Canada that are doing great things as well, I would argue. Like I said at the outset, I have a great deal of sympathy for our law enforcement and our intelligence agencies. I think our law enforcement agencies are actually ill-equipped to meet the challenges. Having spent a lot of time talking to Canada's largest telecom carriers and the people who work for them, I can see that this is an enormous problem for them. There are estimated to be 80,000 zero-day attacks on Canadian networks every single day. Every few seconds, a new zero-day attack they have to deal with. For them, outages of their networks, even for a few minutes, costs potentially millions of dollars for their clients, the banks and so on. So there's a very real problem here that we can't minimize. The issue that I have is throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that in having to deal with these problems, which are very important, we will empower our law enforcement to do things that take us in an Orwellian direction. We have to keep in mind we're a liberal democratic society, and our society is based on principles that protect basic privacy, judicial processes, and so forth, or else we're nothing.
Well, I would have to agree with that, and I would also point out that in the recent Air India inquiry report, Justice Major said that one of the best ways to fight terrorism is to conduct electronic surveillance, meaning surveilling emails, etc. Again, though, it comes back to this thing about if you're going to extend powers, do so with commensurate legal safeguards, such as you need to have those safeguards in place, get a warrant, and have some independent oversight of what's going on.
Alan, I want to change gears here a little bit. What's being done to protect infrastructure, things like nuclear power plants and government computer networks?
Two completely separate questions. The government has a certain set of things it's been doing in the power grid and the nuclear power plants.
Okay, talk to me about them both then.
All right, well, let's do. What's been fascinating on the power grid is that they have been playing ostrich for the last 7 years. Each time somebody had an example of where a real problem existed, they would say, well, it didn't happen to me, so I don't have to do anything about it. And there was a desire, an enormous desire to pretend that attacks were not real. And anyone who would come up with a strategy for why it could never happen was a hero in that arena. Just with Stuxnet, which sort of proved that an air gap, meaning if a computer is not connected to the internet, it can still be attacked, that proved that and then showed how and showed what kind of damage it could do. It's the beginning of the transformation, and we're seeing a willingness on the part of both the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States to say to the power companies, you have to do more. So that one's moving along. It hasn't been good at all. It's moving along. They're beginning to get their house in order. On the government side, they've been spending a fortune, billions, part of that military-industrial complex, and doing a terrible job because much of the money was spent writing reports about security. And just in the last year and a half, they've transformed what they're doing. I'm not sure everybody's going to be happy with this, but they've transformed what they've been doing into what's called continuous monitoring. So they can know the status of security on all of the systems in their network so that attackers can't easily find systems that are not protected. So we're moving from paperwork to continuous monitoring in the government. That's good. We're moving from ostrich to active defense on the power grid. Neither of them are very far along.
I was just going to add to that that it's important to keep in mind when considering this topic that most of what we call cyberspace, as much as 95% of it, is owned by the private sector. And so governments can only do so much. They can set certain regulations, they can do a lot of damage, but really it boils down to providing incentives or regulations that govern the private sector space. Important in this regard, I think, is making it a requirement that companies disclose to consumers when they have been subject to large-scale data breaches. And this hasn't always happened for obvious reasons.
We hear about them all the time in the media, though, don't we?
Well, we hear about some of them, but a lot of them that we don't. The attacks on Google, for example, that came from Chinese space, affected many, many other companies, but we didn't hear about it from those companies. And I think that should be something that's required by law.
Chris, it seems to me it makes good business sense for these very large companies to protect my data and everyone else's data. Why aren't they doing it, or are they just not doing enough?
Well, actually, it doesn't really make good business sense.
Why not?
Because
it's an image thing, right?
Well, if your power company loses your data, who are you going to start getting your power
Okay, but
from?
I'm thinking like Google or Microsoft.
Well, how many of Google's customers ditched them after they got hacked by the Chinese?
Okay, so it doesn't make good business sense. Is that the reason they don't do anything?
If you're a company and you have a fixed budget and you have an opportunity to have engineers working on improving your security or engineers working on new features that will make users happy, you take your engineers and make new fancy features. The reason that companies spend time and money improving their security is the threat of regulation. I think that data breach laws that force consumers to be told when a breach happens, I think they're useful, but they're not a magic bullet. And in fact, companies need to be forced to adopt reasonable industry best practices, because otherwise they're going to stay behind.
Well, from a civil liberties perspective, we would say that some of these best practices absolutely would include the kind of data you're collecting in the first place. If you collect less data, the breaches are going to be less severe. One of the issues that we're running into right now is the immense amount of data that's being collected. We're not even sure for what reason. But once that data is disseminated, then there's a problem. For example, anybody who has a mobile phone, it's possible that the company that is inadvertently or intentionally, but it's possible that they have stored information that would indicate where you've been and who you've been talking to. So where's that information going? And some of the basic principles of privacy protection are that you only collect information that you absolutely need to collect. That has to be disclosed to the consumer. And then that it's retained for only the amount of time that you need it and destroyed. We're not sure that that's happening.
Okay, I don't think this part of the conversation is done, but we're going to switch gears here, Ron, because we have other things we want to talk about. So I'm going to bring up one more thing to read here. Let's take a look at this quotation. It comes from Al Jazeera from a few months ago. Here's what it says. Throughout most of the Middle East and North Africa, online censorship is the norm. The level of censorship varies. In Morocco, only a handful of sites relating to the Western Sahara, Google Earth and LiveJournal, are deemed offensive enough to ban, while other countries like Bahrain, Yemen and Syria filter the internet pervasively, banning political sites as well as social content. Though the filtering itself is conducted by the governments of each country, it's made possible by technology imported mainly from the United States and Canada. In Yemen, until recently, WebSense was the software of choice. The government has since switched to Canadian-built NetSweeper, also used by Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Alan, what's the White House's position on selling online surveillance equipment, often to very, very regressive regimes?
I think they don't think of it as online surveillance equipment. I think they think of it as defensive technologies. So, for example, those tools you talked about are very useful in making sure your users don't show up at websites that will infect them. So they keep track of which websites have infected other machines. They check to see whether or not your user is trying to visit one of those sites, and they either block that or they tell the user he may be getting himself infected. So you could call it a surveillance tool. The users would say thank you because they don't want their machines to be infected, because once their machine is infected with a keystroke logger, you end up with their bank credentials being stolen and their bank accounts being emptied. So I think the White House doesn't think of those technologies. When you talk about the really advanced, what you heard of earlier called deep packet inspection tools, for the most part, they don't like those being exported, but they're not considered sensitive technologies, so they don't have any way to stop it.
Okay, Alan, you're being provocative again. Ron wants to hop in here.
Well, I've spent my career documenting patterns of internet censorship worldwide, and the Al Jazeera report you referenced there was about an investigation that we did where we tracked the sale of Western filtering technologies to regimes around the world. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that these technologies are used widely around the world, not just to block access to spam and malware sites, but most ordinarily to block access to opposition groups, to human rights groups, to gay and lesbian websites. Unfortunately, in many of the cases, the governments are not democratic countries, so they use the technologies in ways that are actually hidden from the users. Blacklists that are used to run these programs are not disclosed to the public. There's enormous collateral filtering, mistaken filtering, in other words. We've seen instances I could cite for the next hour of for example, women's health information being mistakenly blocked as pornography because of the keywords around breast and so on. And this market is now growing enormously because governments are asserting their power in cyberspace. They're requiring internet service providers to put in place these filtering technologies, and the market is responding. In this case, a Canadian company actually stepped into Yemen after an earlier report of ours exposed the fact that an American company, WebSense, was selling to Yemen. WebSense backed out of the market, and a Canadian company stepped in. So this is, again, part of this dynamic.
Chris.
Why should we be shocked that US and Canadian companies are selling products to these governments when US and Canadian weapons manufacturers are not only selling their products, but getting government assistance to send weapons to Qatar and other countries? I mean, you can maybe build a plausible argument that some of these surveillance technologies are dual use, but there are certainly single-use surveillance technologies for which there's no plausible scenario that, oh, this is protecting people from viruses, and these are being sold abroad. I also want to note that the US is now basically engaged in its own form of censorship. Hollywood is pushing through legislation that would allow websites to be blocked if they're suspected of being engaged in copyright infringement. And so in the US, the demon is copyright filtering. In China, it's pornography. In Australia, it's child pornography. In Scandinavia, they have similar blocking. Every country has their own reason for blocking. In China, they say it's for state stability. In the US, we say it's for economic stability to defend these rights holders. But it's the same technologies made by the same companies that are being used to enforce these blacklists. And I think what it really does is it denies us the moral high ground to say, no, you cannot do this, because we're doing it. And China's pointing to activities by the US, to the US shutting down WikiLeaks and forcing these sites off the net. We have no way of being able to say you shouldn't do it, because we're doing it, and we're doing it even better than they are.
Okay, let's use the China example, Sukanya, or other places, probably not the Hollywood example. Where does human rights fit into all of this?
Well, human rights are at the core of this issue, in my opinion, because when you start censoring information on the internet, you're really impacting democracy. Of course, if you have a state saying, well, we're censoring a child pornography site, that doesn't sound like it's offensive. That sounds like maybe it's a good idea. But in the name of censoring child pornography, they will censor a whole bunch of other things, as Ron mentioned as well. You're targeting all kinds of legitimate internet activity under the rubric of one illegitimate hook to hang your hat on, and that becomes a problem. Even today, I read something online. The Assistant Secretary of State in the U.S., Mike Posner, just released a statement concerned about censorship going on around the world and how it affects democracy. You know, I heard what everybody else said. It's a serious problem, though. It has a chilling effect on things that are required for democracy: freedom of information, freedom of expression. Very important.
Alan.
Yeah, it does have a chilling effect. And the only time I ever had a meeting with the president, it was Bill Clinton, on this topic, was when the first big denial of service attack happened in 2000. And we had experts from around the internet coming together. And a guy named Mudge, who was one of the gray hats. You weren't sure whether it was a black hat or a white hat, meaning you weren't sure whether he was always on the good side of the law or not. But he made a plea, and he said, don't criminalize security tools. And that has been one of the great arguments from the beginning of the security field, because the very first security tool was a tool that had a terrible name. It was called Satan. And what it did was checked for vulnerabilities. So in the hands of the defender, in the hands of somebody who's protecting information, it was wonderfully valuable because it would look across all of the systems that you had and check to see if you had any holes that people could come into, and then you could fix them. But in the hands of a bad guy who aimed it at your systems, it was a weapon to identify the systems that could be broken into and then to do it. So all of these tools have this dual use, and I'm not sure how you. I love the idea of stopping their bad use. I'm not sure how you stop their export because they have the dual use.
Well, I think this, I agree with Alan, it's a very difficult issue. You really, you can't regulate out of existence information technology because it'll be created somewhere else in a different jurisdiction. If our products aren't sold in Yemen, another country will most likely step in. But it does raise an important issue, and that is, when we talk about securing cyberspace here in Canada, we are referring to things like, protecting ourselves from viruses and Trojan horses and keeping our banking and telecommunications infrastructure moving sound and so on. In other parts of the world, they have an entirely different notion of what securing cyberspace means. It's primarily about regime security, about keeping troublemakers down, watching opponents and so on. The cybersecurity market that we've created here is now gradually seeping into this world internationally, and it's really changing the ecosystem of cyberspace as a whole. So that's why I think we have to start thinking about global security of cyberspace and what we should do at a policy level internationally.
Okay, we're running short on time. I want an answer from everyone, a short one, about the future. Are we optimistic or pessimistic about the future of cybersecurity? Sukanya, why don't you kick us off here?
Well, I would like to say a bit of both. Pessimistic if we're going to keep increasing surveillance powers and if we're going to allow technologies that don't have proper guidelines going with them. So in other words, we've got to make sure that the private sector is doing its part in keeping information secure. We have to ensure that when law enforcement has access to data, that they're doing so with the proper legal safeguards because it's necessary, because they have reasonable suspicion, there's court oversight, and very importantly in the future, if we have any kind of information sharing going on internationally, that we figure out a system whereby we will have some integrated oversight of what's happening.
Chris, optimistic, pessimistic as we move ahead?
I hate to be the pessimist here, but more surveillance and vast sums of money to be made by the surveillance industrial complex in the name of cyber warfare and cybersecurity.
So you're not very hopeful.
No.
Alan, are you hopeful?
I think there are a couple of good things. It's an arms race, so we're going to be in this for a long time. But the most hopeful thing is this concept of the red and green internet, where we leave the internet as it is for freedom and anonymity, and we have a separate one, which is like toll roads for people to do business transactions and other transactions that have to be protected. So I have some optimism that we can separate the things that need to be protected from the openness of the current internet.
Ron, red door, green door, good idea?
Oh, I think, the green door internet would end up being as bad as the other one. But generally speaking, to answer your question, I'm a pessimist as well, although with an optimistic silver lining. I think right now there is a kind of perfect storm in cyberspace where you have these major converging pressures we've been talking about, hugely exploding ecosystem of cybercrime, espionage, warfare, all coming together at once to subvert this domain entirely. But the optimistic silver lining for me is you really can't put human ingenuity down forever. And I think the creativity that really spawned the internet and the resistance shown by civil liberties advocates and other people will protect us in the long run. At least that's my hope.
Thanks, everybody. Great conversation. Alan Paller is the Director of Research at the SANS Institute in Washington, D.C. Thanks, Alan. And here in studio, we have Sukanya Pillay, who's the Director of the National Security Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and Chris Soghoian, PhD candidate at Indiana University, and he used to be a technologist at the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S., and Ron Diebert, who is the Director of the Citizens Lab here at the University of Toronto. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.